ABC 7 News at 6. On your side.
On March 10th, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jetliner went down over Ethiopia, killing all 157 people on board.
On board, families, scholars, and scientists en route to the UN conference on the environment, and one 24-year-old D.C. woman determined to make the world more equitable for all.
ABC 7 senior investigative reporter Lisa Fletcher sat down with the family of Samya Stumo. They talked about their beloved daughter and how their profound loss is pushing them now to protect other families.
Boeing cut off Samya's life, and that is an absolute tragedy for much more than just our family. It's just multiplied. This loss of Samya is multiplied out 157 times.
Samya Rose Stumo sat in seat 16J on a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jetliner. A last-minute text to her family. She'd soon be in Nairobi. 6 minutes later, pilots struggled to regain control of a plane convulsing in the grip of a faulty automated flight control system. The aircraft torpedoed into the earth at nearly 600 miles an hour. Hours later, Samya's mother, Nadia, would accidentally learn of the crash.
I turned on the BBC and they were talking about the crash. And they talked about 8:36 in the morning. And that is when her flight was going. I started just shaking, like my whole body just couldn't hold itself together.
Within hours, Nadia, her husband Michael, and son Tor were on a plane to Ethiopia. This photo of Samya's brother and her boyfriend at the crash site. There would be no recognizable plane, no recoverable bodies, only a crater.
For Samya Rose, we threw roses into that gravesite. The plane entered the earth, and the people, the parts of the plane, and dirt were all thoroughly mixed together.
While their daughter's remains are in Ethiopia, her spirit is strong and present for a family determined to hold Boeing and the FAA accountable for a system now blamed in 2 737 MAX 8 crashes.
Did the president make this call, or did the FAA make this call?
FAA's the safety regulator. FAA made the call.
The FAA defended Boeing 737 MAX jetliners and was last to ground the planes after most other countries and regulatory agencies acted within 48 hours of the second crash.
We're concerned that there are financial reasons to speed the ungrounding to a degree much faster than it is safe for the public, and we don't want a third crash.
Stumo says they will be ever present on Capitol Hill to make sure the planes are not back in the air before investigations are complete.
We've asked that the families be given a seat at the table, not just the economic stakeholders. We're in the process of requesting a meeting with the FAA now.
This takes work. It takes the kind of work and care that Samya put into her work, effort, actual analysis, expertise, people coming together.
By all accounts, bringing people together for a common cause was something Samya did best. She was on that plane as part of her job at the D.C. nonprofit Think Well, bringing health care to vulnerable populations. Founder Yogesha Rashkotia says her bold ideas and irrepressible spirit made her unstoppable.
She had a wisdom about her that I think a lot of folks who met her could pick up right away. So what we're launching is an initiative to look for women around the world who are similar in terms of Samya's acumen and her vision for what change needs to look like, and support them to accomplish that.
The goal of the Samya Rose Stumo Initiative for Universal Quality Health Care is to offer $100,000 a year to incubate the ideas of young women like Samya with visionary global health goals. The hope is that it will exist for at least 50 years, what would have been the length of her career. Her dad says ideally it will have the kind of impact Samya would have had on the world.
A home run would be if the fellowship got endowed to the extent that it could continue for the duration of Samya's life.
The family is seeking a meeting with the FAA and hoping to be allowed to testify at an upcoming hearing. For demanding change, go to WJLA.com for a lot more, including a story about Samya's life. Plus, you can watch the full-length interview with her parents, Mike and Nadia. There was just so much more to our conversation with her, and we knew you would all want to see it, so we're putting it on our website.
And at least now we feel like we got to know Samya through that conversation.
Yeah.
I know, Lisa, one of the most notable consumer protection advocates, Ralph Nader, is Samya's great uncle. You spent some time talking to him this afternoon. What is he saying?
I did, and he is no stranger, as you know, to the topic of airline safety. He's been across it for more than 2 decades. We did a Facebook Live together. We talked about Samya, his life of activism, and how he's once again laser focused on the airline manufacturing industry and the FAA.
If they keep ignoring what they should be doing, the FAA and Boeing, then it's like a rubber band. You've seen a rubber band, you pull it, things are okay. You pull it some more, things are okay. And then you pull it some more and it snaps. We're at the snap stage now, where more and more automation of these planes are not just augmenting pilot intelligence, they are overpowering pilot intelligence. That's scary.
Yeah. Sobering. Of course, we're going to continue to follow this story as it unfolds. I'll have all the updates on my Facebook page at Lisa Fletcher Reports. Of course, we will always have them on WJLA.com.
Yeah, thank you for bringing us all of these different angles, and we know you will follow what happens next.
Yeah, and I would really encourage people to go to our website and watch all the material. It's pretty incredible.
All right, Lisa.
Very powerful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Look, we still have the sign.
Right.
Samya.
Right, if you try to wake me up before 8:30, I will kill you. Love, Samya.
Samya Stumo's parents, Michael and Nadia, are flooded with memories in their daughter's bedroom.
This is a postcard of our bucket list trip to Norway. Right over that hill is the place called Stumo, which is where we come from. So that's, Samya kept that because that's where our name comes from.
She really loved her time in playing soccer, and she was super competitive. So in this picture, she's like fighting for the ball and winning, and so she loved that picture.
An overachiever from the start, Samya taught herself to read at age 4, had a business raising pigs on the family farm at age 9, and by 14 convinced her parents she was ready for college.
She got herself scholarship, she got herself financial aid, and we were so taken aback. We sort of felt that we couldn't say no.
She learned Spanish and Arabic and wanted to be a doctor until she spent time studying in Peru, where she discovered the medical system designed to help indigenous people was making their lives more difficult.
And so that opened her eyes, and that's why she wanted to have a global health system that was bottom up, that was patient-centered.
She shifted her focus to global health, gaining her master's degree at one of the premier institutions, the University of Copenhagen. After graduation, she sought out one particular D.C. nonprofit. CEO Yogesh Arashkotia.
Samya told me that the reason she wanted to join ThinkWell was because of the mission of this organization. And she told me that she had been tracking this organization long before even applying for the job.
In January of this year, Arashkotia hired Samya as part of his team, dedicated to making global health care accessible and affordable. She was on her way to Africa to lay the groundwork for a $20 million project. Immense responsibility for a 24-year-old.
Normally we wouldn't do that. The work we do requires quite a high degree of maturity, poise, experience, and sort of being seasoned. But Samya somehow had all of that. She had a wisdom about her that I think a lot of folks who met her could pick up right away. And I don't think anybody on the team had any concerns or thought twice about having her exposed to working with government officials from foreign countries.
Arashkotia says Samya's death is devastating to their closely knit D.C. headquarters.
The impact is profound. It's not that it was an abstract colleague that they transacted with here and there, but it was a friend, and it was just somebody who was a part of the mission, and it was somebody that they hung out with and trusted and felt as a part of their lives.
Arashkotia, along with Samya's parents, Michael and Nadia, have started a fund to create a fellowship in Samya's name that will give young women with big, bold ideas to change global health care the support to do it.
And she was on track by coming to think, well, to have a big impact for the next 50 years of her career, and a real disruptive impact on turning global health into bottom up. When she sets her mind on something, look out, and you're actually happy to agree with her. That's the way she was. And so 50 years of that would have been a pretty big change, we think. She would have saved a lot of lives.
This fellow is Micah Messent. He's Canadian. He was 23.
In her absence, Michael and Nadia are hoping they can save some lives too, holding the airlines and the FAA accountable, speaking on Capitol Hill, and encouraging people to use their voice for others, just like Samya did.
Enjoy your minutes with your family. Enjoy all your minutes, and do your best as consumers to speak up and make this world safer, because if you speak up, it'll be safer for a lot of other people, not just your family. Boeing cut off Samya's life, and that is an absolute tragedy for much more than just our family. That's a tragedy for all the work she would have done. Plus, if you look at the 156 other human beings that I've been getting to know over the time, probably I only know something about 15 of them, but all of them were giving people who were making positive change in this world. All of them were super talented and had been selected to go to the UN conference or go to other conferences that the plane was headed for. So it's just multiplied. This loss of Samya is multiplied out 157 times, and it's just horrendous. It should never happen again. And the only way that we're going to protect ourselves and the world from aviation safety defects is to have a good FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. It has to be competent. It has to be able to look at problems, identify them, and correct them. The FAA as it exists now is underfunded, and it does not have that capacity. It doesn't have the capacity to look at software issues. It just doesn't have the personnel, doesn't have the systems. That's terrible. That's not just terrible for us, it's terrible for the world. And there could be a third crash like this because of that situation. And that's what we want to stop. We want to stop
no third crash.
No third crash. And the only people who can actually do that are the public, because the government and the industry have so much financial pressure on them. They are not going to do this without public pressure. They just will not. They're trying to put these planes back in the air. It is clear that they have a timetable. They say we have no timetable, but they have a timetable. Minimize the loss, the financial loss, and get those planes back as fast as possible. But the timetable is not to do with the safety of the software and other essential components. That's not, as far as I can see, in their timetable. So as victims, families, we're trying to push that perspective. No more risks. Let's be as absolutely safe as possible, and let our government have the resources to be able to accomplish that mission. It's incredibly important. All of you people out there, you have to speak up for your own safety.
Boeing should have, right at the beginning, they should have had family reach out. The only thing they said is in a press conference, the obligatory no apology that we're very sorry, and then go on to talk about chain of events and pilot error. They're on the Hill focusing on pilot error. They are a national champion airline for the United States. The presidents market their airplanes to third world countries in presidential visits. They need to have a bulletproof plane that can be flown by everyone, that always stays in safety margins, that they're not blaming the very pilots in the developed world countries that they're selling it to. And when something happens, they should say, we're fixing it, we're going to take the time necessary, we're going to rehire those engineers, safety engineers that we fired. That was a mistake. It was a mistake back in 2004 or so to have the regulatory program so that the FAA engineers on site can't actually do anything, that they can be overruled by management and financial issues. Those were mistakes. We understand that now. We're going to correct them. That's what they should do, and they should have. Ethiopia Airlines has family reach out. They have an email list. It's not perfect.
Family
it's something,
support.
Family support.
They sent us a condolence letter.
They sent us a condolence letter within 2 days. And Boeing is just worried about shareholders and, you know, lobbying in Congress. I mean, there's just no heart there.
And also, they're doing bad for Boeing. It's horrible that this happened for Boeing. If you just look at it from a financial standpoint, I would think the shareholders would say, you're not running our company well at all. Go away. We need better people to run our company. Because this is not far-sighted just from the financial health of the company. And it's all not far-sighted now to say we just need to get them back up in the air as fast as possible, as fast as possible. No, you need to have engineers in your management, which they don't have now, no engineers on their board of directors, and you need to have safety first. And you don't need to do the rushing thing, which is what caused this crash. Just continuing on the same behavior is lethal.
There's people that lost more than us. There's Paul Njoroge, Njoroge, he's Kenyan, he's living in Toronto. He lost his wife, 3 kids, and a mother-in-law. We lost our daughter, and it's hard. He lost everything. Paul from Poland, what's his last name? Konarski lost his wife and his only
little son, a year and a half.
They won't even, you know, Paul won't even live in his house because what's the point? He's only surrounded by memories. I mean, we at least have each other. We have our 2 other boys.
There's another Canadian who lost 6 members of his family, his parents, his sister, her husband, and their 2 daughters. It is awful. And Samya would definitely point that out. And she would definitely point out that the information that caused our pilots to be safer in flying this plane did not flow to mid and low income countries, to their pilots. And Samya was all about equitable flow of information and resources. And this is clearly not happening here. We have a hotline where pilots can call into our government and with their safety concerns, and it can be anonymous. That information is not flowing to developing countries. So that's wrong. Any alarm, any pilot calling in with an anonymous tip should be shared internationally. That just should happen automatically. That's like security. It's security for our lives. We would do that if it was a tip about a terrorist. This is a tip about a plane that could fly into the ground. You know, we have to have that in place.
If you're selling planes and you're competing with Airbus across the world, everywhere, and you want to be the dominant airline globally, you have to have, again, planes that are bulletproof. And to see what these pilots went through, and maybe they weren't 30-year Air Force trained pilots, like, you know, sometimes they are in the U.S., then only sell to them, or, you know, airlines that are going to use them. But you can't.
Boeing has to have discipline. They have to have discipline. If you can't afford the training for your pilots, you can't buy the plane.
The proposal now is to have another hour or 2 of iPad training and not simulator training.
We have friends that know the father of the Ethiopian Kenyan pilot. His mom is Kenyan, his dad is Ethiopian, and he said he lost his support in life. So it's devastating for Ethiopia. The people there were so kind to us. They extended themselves. That we met with the CEO of the airlines. They were in grief themselves as a country. This is their pride and joy, their airlines. They wanted to be a leader in Africa. And indeed, a lot of these people working for NGOs chose that flight to support African industry, to support African airlines. You're going to do work in these countries, you should patronize their businesses.
And the CEO, his safety director, his medical director were all there in the meeting with us. We had a personal meeting with them, and they were, as you say, they were in grief. They knew the people on the plane. There was the crew, you know, the flight attendants, the pilots. They knew them all. They had, you know, personal, you know, friends.
Long-standing connections, yeah.
Can you guys walk me through from the morning of March 10th until getting to Ethiopia, kind of that whole, I'm sure a lot of it's a blur.
My son was sick. He made it to the bottom of the stairs, 20 years old. He got a bug at probably at a restaurant. And I went into the laundry room over there, and I was dealing with a lot of mess, and I just turned on the BBC on my phone. And first I looked at my phone. Yeah, it's 3 in the morning. So the crash happened at 1. It was 2 hours after the crash happened. And I first looked at my phone, and it had a message from Samya, a group message to the family saying, I'm on the flight to Nairobi in 2 more hours and I'll be there. It was just a, check-in type of a message. And then I turned on the BBC, and they were talking about the crash. And they talked about 8:36 in the morning. And that is when her flight was going. And I was like, Ethiopian Airlines going to Nairobi from that airport. There's not 2 flights at 8:36 in the morning, but I really wanted there to be 2 flights. And I really wanted her not to be on that flight. So I started just shaking. Like my whole body just couldn't hold itself together. And then I was so alarmed. I didn't want to upset other people in the family, especially my son was sick. I was just cleaning up and listening, and her boyfriend called. And he is a resident at UCSF.
Medical resident.
Yeah. And he was up doing his shift, and he knew her when she was flying, and he saw the news about the crash. And he called me and he said, I think that Samya might have been on that flight. And I said, I think she might have been. And then we got in touch with her job, Yogesh, and they sent us her actual itinerary, and she was on the flight. And then we just started driving. I woke up Mike. He thought I was crazy. I was like, Samya, I think Samya was on a plane crash in Ethiopia. And he's like, Ethiopia? Because he was expecting her to be in Nairobi. And he's like, what? No. He said, I'm sure that's not true. And then he realized that maybe it was true. And we just got sick son, Mike. We just got in the car and started driving.
The flight, there was no question. Tora was just pacing and sobbing.
We didn't know that there were no survivors. We thought maybe she's injured. Maybe she's in a field. Maybe she's in a hospital. And so we just started driving to JFK. We got there to the parking lot, and we were on the phone with her job.
Long-term parking.
Getting ourselves on a flight. And then we were inside the airport. We were in Qatar. We were on Qatar Airlines. We had stopped in the Gulf. And we learned that there were no survivors. And so then we knew when we got to Ethiopia, we were picked up by the embassy personnel, and we drove to the hotel, and we were sure that we could get Samya's body because a CNN reporter was standing outside of the crash site, and she said, as I'm standing here, 6 bodies are being loaded onto these vans. And the Red Cross workers are having a moment of silence for each individual after they load the body. And so we showed that tape to the embassy, and we said, we're sure we can get a body. We're sure. And it took us days and days and days to understand. We interviewed the reporter. She said she didn't actually see the bodies. She just assumed because the bags.
That first day when we were there, we did. Yeah.
Then the next day we interviewed a Red Cross worker, and that person said there were no bodies. We were filling the bags, and after we finished filling a bag, that's what we had. That's what we had in the van to carry human remains in. So we filled the bag, and then we had a moment. But what is in the bag is from different people. It does not have skin on it. These are chunks of flesh. That's what he said. I remember that very clearly. Chunks of flesh. And then we ended up on Friday talking to the medical director of Ethiopian Airlines, and she explained that the largest piece was a femur, the largest piece of a human, that the skulls were all broken into pieces. We said, well, we have a picture of her tattoo. We have pictures of her rings. We could get some relic of Samya to bring home and have a funeral. We want to bury her. And they just explained that it took us that long from Sunday when the crash happened until Friday to understand that the plane entered the earth, and the people, the parts of the plane, and dirt were all thoroughly mixed together. And so there was no kind of ability to recover. And now we don't know where Samya's remains are. They took a bunch of remains to a cold storage. They took our DNA. We don't know if Samya's entire remains are there in the field, or if part of her is in the cold storage or what. And we're still really concerned about that. We're concerned about the site is apparently still open. It's raining in Ethiopia. It's a rainy season now.
When we met with the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, he told us about going there. He got to the crash site 3.5 hours later, and you could see he was a little bewildered still, because he said, I got there and we had a crash, and we got there and there's a hole. There's no plane. I don't see a plane. I see a piece of metal the size of my arm, but there's no plane. When we got there to the crash site, they had roped it off, and they had people with guns and sticks to keep you away from the crater itself. But Nadia and
They didn't want to block us. We just went and looked into the crash site, and we threw roses that we had gotten from our friends in Denmark, had sent roses to our hotel, and we threw, for Samya Rose, we threw roses into that grave site. But we didn't, even when we were at the crash site on Thursday, we didn't understand that those pile of rubble that we saw, all the parts of the plane we saw, that was all dug out of the ground. We didn't understand until Friday that there was no plane at all visible right after the crash.
The thing just tunneled itself, buried itself in the ground, and just sort of broke apart altogether. The pieces of the plane were very small. I mean, these are pieces of metal that should withstand, high stress. They're very small. And they had pieces of the plane piled up, but there wasn't a whole plane there. It was so far in the ground that they had an excavator with a 20-foot arm that they were digging, plane pieces and people pieces and everything out of it and collecting some of that. And they probably hadn't gotten to half the plane yet.
And I don't know whether they have excavated the entire plane. I don't know the answer to that.
We were able to convince the Ethiopian Airlines people to let in, Interpol or third parties to do the disaster victim identification, because we were concerned that they would botch it and didn't have the local expertise, which they were, protective of their sovereignty, which I understand, but you can protect your sovereignty and have someone do it for you. And they relented, and we were happy about it. But then we decided later, we want Samya to stay there. We don't want her dug up. We don't want her put in bags. We don't want her put in cold storage and washed and rinsed and matched with our DNA. This is where she's buried. It's an agricultural field, rolling hills in an Orthodox Christian country. She was raised Orthodox Christian. She liked agriculture. It's like
she loved East Africa.
Loved East Africa. It's like a arid East Africa version of this area, which is rolling hills and agriculture. And so that's her place. She's buried. So we thought, if it was up to us, don't dig anymore. Let it sit there.
But we don't actually know where Samya's remains are. So we didn't have a choice to do what we would have preferred. Mm-hmm. But if you stand with your back to the crash site and you look at the scene, Samya would have loved it. It's all hand agriculture, small plots of sorghum and teff, which make the delicious bread that Ethiopians eat, the injera. And it's just a lovely place to be that she would have enjoyed very much. So we're hoping that Rotary is very prominent in Ethiopia, and Samya loved Rotary, and she loved her Rotary exchange, and we're hoping someday that maybe a young lady can come from that area to our agricultural area and experience our high school like Samya had experienced a high school in Peru. We would love to have that exchange. We also think that maybe there's no church in that area, and we'd like to help to help make a church there. But primarily, we're interested in a non-religious memorial at the site, a marker. And I don't know how to go about coordinating or being in touch with other families about that, but it should definitely reflect all of the different people that sacrificed their lives. And no more sacrifice. All you people listening to this program, protect yourselves. Make sure that we have a lot of resources in our government. We have plenty of money. We can have an excellent FAA, and we should be a leader in the world in that. And we should protect ourselves and everybody who flies.
Is the relationship between the FAA and Boeing a little too cozy?
We've heard that it is. We're not experts. We're learning a lot more than we ever wanted to. But it's our understanding that the relationship is way too cozy, that the engineers on the ground from the FAA do not have the authority to do what's needed, that the authorized representatives on the Boeing side, if they get a little bit too creative and their objections are on what could get wrong, they get reassigned somewhere else. If that's all true, it absolutely needs to change, and it looks like in 2004 that changed, where you didn't have the actual engineering expertise on the ground be able to make the decisions. You had the Boeing financial people be able to use pressure and obstruct what would be most safe for passengers.
Can Boeing be trusted?
Not with the management they have right now, but they could clean up their company. They were a great company. So I think this has taken a long time to deteriorate in their company. You hear news reports that they have bad parts in their planes, parts that are, I can't remember the word, but
there needs to be
counterfeit parts in their planes. So there's quite a lot of problems with the company, but I think it should be cleaned up.
New leadership, totally dedicated to safety, totally dedicated to quality, totally dedicated to reclaiming Boeing's status as a premier national champion airline that deservedly airplane manufacturer that can lead the world.
Nadia, you've talked about this before. When people refer to this as an accident.
Oh, it's a crash, and it was caused by human beings that didn't have the right training and didn't have the right, Boeing should own the pilot error and the defects in the plane. They own all of that. And so it's created by Boeing. Boeing cut Samya's life short and the life of 157 people and more, 340 plus people, including the Indonesian victims. So that was accomplished by Boeing and didn't need to happen.
We've asked that the families be given a seat at the table, not just the economic stakeholders. We're in the process of requesting a meeting with the FAA now. We were involved in the process in Ethiopia. We're not in this country. We need to be involved. We're concerned on the pilot training that they're only changing rules to allow another hour or two of iPad training, not full simulator training that appropriately reflects the dangers, the problems that the pilots can get into. And on the software itself, there's a long history of engineering safety with mechanical, electrical issues, with redundancies, with a lot of testing. But with software, there's not. That culture hasn't carried over to the software side. There's a lot of gaps of redundancy with the software. We don't think there's regulations even governing software in the FAA. We're not sure that there are people that are employed by the FAA that have the ability to evaluate software at a granular level. We're not sure that if someone who can evaluate software can even do it without really going to the people who wrote it in the first place and really running it through the paces. And we're not sure even with that you can truly know it's safe until it has had a lot of flight time and faced a lot of different conditions, a lot of different altitudes and the like. Certainly with AI-driven cars by Google and everybody who's trying that out, they're on the road all over the place testing this software, testing the sensors long before it's ever released upon the public. And we don't do that in aviation for some reason. So we're concerned that there are financial reasons to speed the ungrounding to a degree much faster than it is safe for the public, and we don't want a third crash.
Do you think the FAA, Nadia, is rushing to put these planes back in the air before all of the investigations are complete?
I don't understand why the FAA isn't saying we need more resources. We want to do this right. We'd like to hire people that understand this software aspect to it. Why aren't they asking for support and trying to become more engaged? They act like they're an employee of the short-sighted leadership of Boeing, which isn't even really good for Boeing. I think one problem is that software is often written by machine. It's not even written by regular people. And then that's even hard to go back and figure out what was the logic of the machine in writing the software. So this is super important, very technical. It's something that we have to get a hold of as a society. We're going to have artificial intelligence more and more as part of our lives, and we need to be able to test it and figure out the safety. And you would think that the FAA would want to be doing that and would want to have premier resources from our country to get that done. I'm confused why they want to ignore that and why they want to just pretend that they have it all together.
How long should these planes stay grounded?
Until we figure out exactly why they crashed. If Boeing knows, they're not saying, and then how to prevent that from happening again. So it's impossible that they should go up in July, or I've heard October. People have put out different times, August, people have said. So that's all impossible to do a good job. This takes work. It takes the kind of work and care that Samya put into her work, effort, actual analysis, expertise, people coming together. That's what our country is famous for. We're not afraid of work. Let's get this done. It's not going to happen by October.
There's several investigations going on. There's even a criminal investigation by the Department of Justice. There's grand jury. We don't even know what it's about. To what extent does it impact on this case? To what extent was there criminal behavior in the chain of events that led to Samya's death? We don't know. But the purpose of all these investigations, an inspector general investigation, a blue ribbon commission established by Secretary of Transportation Chow, an investigation including the international aviation authorities. There's one by experts from NASA and the Air Force and other government agencies. The purpose is to leave no stone unturned, we have been told. And so how can you unground this until the investigations are done and the stones have all been unturned and you can correct it all? The FAA could be bulletproof by waiting for those investigations to be done, looking at everything, because this is a whole system, and looking at everything that did or could have gone wrong or could be improved, and then make sure that's covered and then unground the plane. Doing so before the investigations that the DOT itself has ordered doesn't make any sense.
It's very important for that all to be transparent to the public and for the public to put the appropriate pressure saying, let's finish the investigations, let's get this right. Who's going to make any profit ever if another plane crashes? Nobody's going to fly. I mean, can we just look a little further down the road here?
If they would have gotten on this after the first crash, they wouldn't have had a second crash, and they're worried about financial issues after the first crash. Now you go from a second crash to a third crash, and whatever financial issues are going on right now will pale in comparison to what a third crash will produce.
I don't want Boeing to fail as a company. I want them to succeed, and I want them to create safe airplanes for all of us, and I want them to be a leader, and I want them to lead the world in safety and great airplanes. But that is not the company that we're looking at right now. There have to be some major changes to come back to that company.
They need leadership that says that. That's what they're going to do, and actually does it, not just messages it.
This is important also for all those employees, all the people that work for Boeing. They have to work for a secure company that does the right thing. That's why employees get so upset when there's counterfeit parts. That's why they report it, because they want a secure company. They don't want a company that's going to fall apart.
Is there anything you guys want to add that we haven't talked about?
enjoy your minutes with your family. You know, enjoy all your minutes and do your best as consumers to speak up and make this world safer, because if you speak up, it'll be safer for a lot of other people, not just your family.
Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Lisa Fletcher. I'm the senior investigative reporter at the ABC television station in Washington, D.C. And I have the honor to be sitting here with Ralph Nader today. For those of you who don't know him, which would be hard to believe anybody wouldn't know that name, he is one of the most notable consumer protection and government reform activists of our time. He is responsible for everything from the way auto safety occurs in the United States, starting back in the 1960s with his very famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed. You are responsible for landmark legislation, everything from the Clean Water Act to the Freedom of Information Act, the Whistleblower Protection Act. He's had his magnifying glass on the airline industry for close to 3 decades. And that is really why we are here talking today. You're launching another investigation into the airline industry, this time for a much more personal reason. Ralph's grandniece, Samya Stumo, was one of 157 people on the ill-fated Boeing 737 MAX 8 that went down in Ethiopia on March 10th. And I'm so sorry. Tell me about her. I know you two were close.
Well, we had dinner with her on Friday, and she was her usual optimistic, upbeat, incisive, contrarian self. And as she walked out the door, she turned around, smiled, and said, "I'll see you in April." And 2 days later, she was dust, along with 156 other people. And I don't mind saying, killed by Boeing's bosses, who overruled their own engineers, built an unstable plane, didn't tell the pilots, didn't tell the airlines, sometimes didn't inform over the months the FAA. And the planes crashed, and it wasn't the pilots, it was the hidden hand of the software that kept pushing the nose down. Pilots would push it up, they couldn't figure out what was happening, push the nose down until the software overpowered the pilots.
Clarify the timeline a little bit for me, Ralph, because there was the first crash of the Lion airplane in October.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, the crash in Ethiopia. What came out in the press was that Boeing was aware of issues with the MCAS system before the Lion Air crash in October. Any sense of why that wasn't addressed between the first crash and the second crash? What was going on behind the scenes?
What was going on was Boeing was frantic in their offices. All kinds of ferment, all kinds of arguments. People would say, "I told you so." Engineers were overruled. Then the question was, how much did they tell the board of directors? And when did they tell them? And how much did they tell the FAA? Well, they told the FAA after the Lions crash that they were going to rework the software and get the glitches out, and they admitted some miscues like telling the pilot X when it was Y in flight. And they took their sweet time to do it. So it went into November, and then it went to December. And believe it or not, in December, they had a board of directors meetings where they announced $20 billion in stock buybacks instead of putting the money into a new plane and safety. So they still didn't get it. After the Lions crash and 180 some people killed in the Java Sea off Indonesia. So January comes, February comes, and the toady FAA is not saying, "Hey, what's going on here? These planes are in the air. They're flying every day in airlines all over the country, the 737 MAX 8. And that was the problem, that the FAA is like a consulting firm. It's not a regulator. It doesn't say, "We want it and we want it now, otherwise we're going to ground the planes." And then the crash occurred in Ethiopia.
You mentioned that this was all the way up to the board of directors, that engineers weren't being listened to. Are there no engineers on the Boeing board of directors? Because you would think they would certainly object.
Yeah, not as such. It's a specialized area. And the bosses of aircraft manufacturers don't like to be second-guessed by someone on the board who knows as much as they do. So they make sure that people who are on the board, they may have other distinguished backgrounds. Carolyn Kennedy, the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, is on the board, and the Trump's ambassador to the UN, She's now on the board. Of course, they don't know anything about airlines and airline safety. They're looking for a rubber stamp, a celebrity panel of rubber stampers.
You've often focused your energies on what you refer to as unaccountable power.
Mm-hmm.
How does unaccountable power play into this scenario? Is it with Boeing? Is it with the FAA? Is it with both?
Well, in every conceivable way. The FAA has been described by its critics as having a tombstone mentality. That is, you have to have like 5 crashes of planes who had inadequate de-icing during winter and brought the planes down before the FAA woke up and said, you know, this 1950 standard is a bit antiquated. We have to have a modern de-icing requirement. That's the tombstone mentality. Well, it was coupled with the FAA being pressured by Congress under the influence of Boeing, which gives money to 330 members of Congress, campaign cash, and a dutiful White House under Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, that kept pushing the FAA, cutting the budgets, cutting the skill level of the FAA, and telling the FAA, delegate more to Boeing. Let them have their own inspectors. Don't even appoint the inspectors that are going to be approving the various parts of an aircraft design. Just make sure that Boeing self-inspects, because it'll save us money.
I want to talk more specifically about that. This is an issue about designees, but I want to make sure we're also getting questions in from the folks who are watching. And Morgan, my producer, is standing by, and I am not having any luck on my iPad.
Okay.
How about you?
A lot of people just kind of wanted to know how this could happen. Something like this could happen. We've talked a lot about that.
I guess a logical question from how could this happen is, are we still in a state where a third crash is possible?
Pardon?
Could a third crash be possible if these 737 MAX 8s get back up in the air?
Oh yes, of course, because the structural design defect is not cured by the software. The software has its own limitations. It can have glitches. It cannot take into account all the scenarios, just some of the scenarios. And it may be defective. A bird may hit the sensors, for example, and take them out of operation. But the real problem is the larger engines vectored forward more than the old 737 engines, vectored up more, overloaded the old fuselage and led to a different center of gravity and different aerodynamic design.
So there's a balance problem.
Yeah, so it goes up and it's prone to stall. No aircraft should ever be built prone to stall, quite apart from the quality of the pilots. That's another issue. The pilot could stall, but no aircraft should be built aerodynamically prone to stall. That's the problem with the design of the 737 MAX 8. And they want to build 5,000 of them. And they've already built slightly less than 300 that are in the hands of the airlines but are now grounded worldwide. So you say it can happen again? Of course. Boeing will say, well, come on, any pilot worth his or her salt can handle this, right? But you don't build a plane for the best pilots. You build a plane for the lowest common denominator aviation certified pilots in all airlines around the world. It's like you don't build a car that's unstable on cornering saying, well, good drivers can take care of that. No, you've got to build it to the lowest common denominator. And the person who said that is the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, Robert Zumwalt, in testimony before the House when some members of the Republican side of the committee tried to blame the Ethiopian Indonesian pilots, and he politely interjected that planes have to be designed for the lowest common denominator certified pilot anywhere in the world. So it could happen again. I've had experts say it's going to happen again, and that's why they're arguing for recalling the plane and never allowing it to fly again, because the only way it can fly again is to take its engines off and put smaller engines on the way they are now on the 737-800NG, which, by the way, doesn't have the instability prone to stall problem. Therefore, it doesn't require all this complex software that Boeing is trying to work and rework. And let me tell you, they're going nuts with the complexity of this and its ability to malfunction.
You know better than anybody the pressures that occur when profits intersect with politics. And you've got a situation here where United, several other airlines, the largest airline touring company in Europe, have all announced major losses this last quarter as attributed to either not being able to fly their MAX 8s or not getting delivery on MAX 8s and having to rent other planes. How much pressure is on lawmakers right now, and frankly the FAA, to get these planes back in the air before they're ready?
Well, there's huge pressure, although the airlines will be reimbursed by Boeing, and Boeing is heavily insured and has a lot of money, can deduct it as expenses, lower what few taxes they pay. There is huge pressure, and it's not what you might think. It's not just commercial pressure. Once these planes are up in the air, which is why the FAA and Boeing are rushing to get them up in the air, it will deter the fervor of the existing investigations. In the House, Senate, the Department of Transportation Inspector General, even though they will deny it, but they will be confronted with the media and others saying, you're alarming millions of passengers with your continued investigation and casting doubt on this plane. See? And then they'll say, and you're undermining our airlines by pursuing this investigation. And it's in the normal pattern of political lethargy in Congress to start pulling back. In fact, the Senate committee's already pulling back. They haven't announced their second hearing, and Senator Wicker from Mississippi, who's the chair, has said he's not going to have Boeing officials testify until the FAA recertifies the MAX.
Speaking of testifying, your grandniece, Samya, her parents, Michael Stumo and Nadia Milleron, want to testify. They were at that first subcommittee hearing. They held photos. They were not permitted to speak that day, but they want to speak. Is that going to happen?
I think it will, because the families of the deceased passengers have great moral authority and moral power, and they begin to know what they're talking about because they study it, and they're able to ask questions experts won't ask, because they're moral questions, they're ethical questions, they're amateur questions that really come to the core of what political representatives should be doing for the people, where the technical experts are sort of lost in the weeds, you know. And also, a lot of people in the whole industry censor themselves. They're worried about, you know, their consultantships, their job, their bonuses, whatever. So it's very important to put the families front and center, and remember that the 9/11 Commission of Inquiry that George W. Bush instituted would never have occurred without the families organizing and putting pressure on the Bush-Cheney administration, because the Bush-Cheney administration had no interest in an official inquiry. So there's an example of people who don't have specialized skills, but they got a presidential commission.
Morgan, do we have some more questions? Since I still am not...
There's nothing really here, but I think one of the questions that I kept seeing was, so what can the average consumer do?
Yeah, it's a great question. What are consumers to do now?
Well, it's pretty easy what to do. The first thing is, whenever they want to fly a plane, if the MAX is ungrounded, right now they don't have to worry.
Right.
They call up, you know, United, and they make a reservation, Delta, American. They say, and by the way, is this a plane that I'm on, a 737 MAX 8? And if they say yes, you say, well, get me another plane. Now, the airlines, for public relation purposes, at least now, are saying they will try to do that. But they don't like that. That goes after the trademark. It goes after the branding. And Boeing and the airlines are more frightened of consumer boycotts going after the branding than they are of the toady FAA and the politically indentured members of Congress, because there's huge money built into the brand. That's why Donald Trump tweeted a few weeks ago saying, advising Boeing to change its brand. Can you imagine how deceptive, put forth by the President of the United States? And that's why we have thousands of these buttons, Axe the Max, which we want people to put up and then take a picture and then put it on YouTube or on some other part of the internet, so the whole idea of consumers individually, not much power, together, tremendous power.
So you're advocating not for these planes to be redesigned because your position is they can't be redesigned safely. They should just be not in the air ever again.
Yeah,
The MAX 8s.
well, what they can do is take the engines off, put regular engines on.
Turn them back into the old 737 NGs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
They're going to take a loss? Too bad. How about the loss of 346 innocents in the Java Sea and in a field in Ethiopia? This idea of worrying more about Boeing, which is drowning in profits, so much so they don't know what to do with their tens of billions of dollars other than to buy back their stock to increase the yardsticks for their own executive compensation. Buying back stock doesn't create a single job. It has no productive impact. It's done in order to make the earnings price ratio look good, and hopefully it'll increase the stock, but mostly it doesn't increase the stock over the long run. The value, what it does is it increases the pay for people like CEO Muhlenberg of Boeing.
I want to go back to something we started to talk about earlier, and Morgan, please interrupt if you get your questions linked up again. The idea of this designee program, where it's not an actual FAA inspector certifying a plane, it could very well be a member of the Boeing team. Talk about that and how that played into what happened with the MAX 8.
Well, first, regulators are supposed to be arm's length, and they have federal cops on the corporate beat. Forget about that with the FAA. Then, over the years in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they would say, well, we got to save money, and we can't have people looking at every nut and bolt of the plane that's being built and certifying it's safe. So we will designate people in Boeing to be representatives of the FAA on site. And they could then say, okay, this section of the plane looks like it adheres to safety standards, and they'll put a stamp on it, and they'll say, we certify it on behalf of the FAA. Even though the FAA is not paying them, Boeing is paying them. The next stage down into the pits is where Boeing picks these people. The FAA doesn't pick them, and where these people have to report to Boeing superiors rather than the FAA and can be intimidated, 5 days a week. So that's where it's at now. It's not regulation. It's hardly delegation. It's turning the FAA into a consulting firm. And most people have no idea about this. They think when they're on the plane, the FAA rules rule. FAA requirements. The flight attendants say you can't smoke in, and in the old days they say you can't smoke in the restroom, or you have to put your tables back up because we're about to land. People have no idea that the corporations have taken over.
How do you unwind that?
By having legislation restore regulatory authority and responsibility to the FAA. Senator Richard Blumenthal of my home state, Connecticut, is drafting a bill. He's trying to get Republican support in the Senate so it can go through, and of course it would go through the House, which is controlled by the Democrats, and Donald Trump will have a hard time not signing that one. We have to turn consulting firms paid by the taxpayer called the FAA into a traffic cop, an enforcing agency of health and safety standards, including air quality in the cabin.
In 1995, you wrote Collision Course, The Truth About Airline Safety. That was 29 years ago now. What's changed? What's better? What's worse? Where are we at?
Well, two interesting things. One is the FAA has delegated more of its responsibility. Its talent and skill level has been shrunken by budget cuts from Congress under the influence of the aviation industry. And it's been run by real politicians. I mean, they don't say to their superiors, look, we're in trust to tens of millions of passengers. Don't mess with us. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board, which hasn't got any regulatory authority, they do say that. They say, don't mess with us. We're supposed to be honest investigators of crashes. We're going to come with our conscientious and skilled report. Don't mess with us politically. The FAA has never been able to do that. Furthermore, there's been more deferred maintenance. There's a lot of air traffic control investment with modern equipment that has not been put. As the airports get busier and busier, in the next 20 years, the projection is going to be double the number of airline passengers using U.S. airports. And if you've been to any U.S. airports, you know there's not much elbow room these days. Now, the second change since my book came out, Collision Course, which was endorsed by Peter DeSavio, who happens to be now the chairman of the House Transportation and Commerce Committee. He's going to be in charge of the hearings and the investigation.
Representative DeFazio.
That's right,
Yes,
from Oregon. All
My
right,
home state.
Yes. See, you have a home state legislator. I have a home
That's
state legislator. So the other thing will startle people, that because the engineering systems in the 737s before the MAX were so brilliant and so proficient and so redundant that they had a really good safety record in the U.S., not so much abroad. So in the last 10 years, just think of this, millions and millions of flights, hundreds of millions of passengers, one fatality. So it's a spectacular performance. But in the aviation industry, it's what happens now and in the future that counts. And if they keep ignoring what they should be doing, the FAA and Boeing, if Boeing moves from an engineering corporation to an investment corporation worried about its stock price and executive bonuses and cutting corners and repressing their own engineers who send them warnings, then it's like a rubber band. You've seen a rubber band, you pull it, things are okay. You pull it some more, things are okay. And then you pull it some more and it snaps. We're at the snap stage now, where more and more automation of these planes are not just augmenting pilot intelligence, they are overpowering pilot intelligence. That's scary.
Is this limited to just one airline manufacturer?
That's part of it. It used to be, okay, Boeing, if you're not doing your job, we'll go to McDonnell Douglas. Or McDonnell Douglas will go to Boeing. And before that, there were 4 or 5 aircraft manufacturers. Now there's one in the U.S. For major aviation types, wide body and narrow body, and there's Airbus. So there's just 2 in the world.
Well, I was thinking about Airbus having a very similar plane to the 737, and if you had any similar concerns. I know it sits off the ground higher. It's not as low riding as...
Yes, because its fuselage was built in the 1980s rather than 1960s, where the 737 fuselage was built. It was more able to avoid the problems, and the Airbus engineers were allowed to do their job, and they didn't have this problem of prone to stall. And their software does not overpower the pilots. And so when American Airlines in 2011 did the unthinkable and order Airbus, that startled Boeing. And Boeing scrapped its plan to build a new clean sheet narrow-body aircraft, and they went with another tweak of, they went with another tweak of the 737 and turned it into a MAX and a prone-to-stall disaster.
I think a lot of people are wondering, why doesn't Boeing just have a clean sheet design, make a new aircraft? Explain the difficulties in clean sheet design in terms of length of time, certification.
Yeah. Well, it'll take about 8 years, and Boeing wasn't going to wait for U.S. Airlines to order more Airbuses, so it was a competitive race, and they cut corners, and they fell behind Airbus. And the second thing is, it's not money. It takes about $10 billion to do a clean sheet airplane and start producing it. And Boeing has blown $40 billion, 4 times that much in stock buybacks since 2009.
So if it's not about money, what's it about?
It's about getting the plane up quicker, and so they could put out the 737-800 MAX a few years quicker than a clean sheet airplane. And more profitable, because they don't have to invest the $10 billion.
Questions?
One of the people, I probably just addressed it, but someone just joined and said, what failures in regulation led to the defective design being improve anything that has to do with
Yeah, I think we just discussed that. Yeah. You know, one of the concerns, and it may not be directly related to the 737 MAX 8, but the industry, the manufacturing industry in general, and the outsourcing of parts being made in Brazil or El Salvador. Talk about that, your concerns associated with it.
Yeah, in the last 20 years, the airlines said, well, we can save money. We don't want to pay the rates charged by U.S. mechanics. We're going to fly these planes to El Salvador and now to Brazil and to Singapore, across the whole Pacific, and still make money because these mechanics are working for a pittance. Well, they're also not inspected as well by the FAA as domestic U.S. mechanics in Oklahoma, for example, are. And there are all kinds of other differences. So this is an accident waiting to happen. You know, you can imagine the security's not as great. Let's say counterfeit or bogus parts get into the maintenance, say in a place like El Salvador, the plane is sent back, it's in the air, you have a disaster, then maybe the FAA will wake up. Maybe the Congress will wake up. But the people who have to wake up first and foremost, Lisa, are the airline passengers, which is why I urge them to go to flyersrights.org. That's a descendant of our original Aviation Consumer Action organization, and join up and support and look at the website, up to date, everything's going on, including your seat size, congestion, how they're gouging you in tickets and charging you for reservation changes, $200, and all the rest of the things they're doing to irritate airline passengers. They're on the website, flyersrights.org. And as a personal note, it's run by Paul Hudson, who lost his daughter, 16-year-old daughter, in the Pan Am 103 explosion over Scotland 30 years ago. And he's never stopped fighting for airline safety. So give him a hand.
You've been an activist your entire life. You know how powerful a single voice can be, but I think a lot of people, because I hear this all the time in my work, is it doesn't make any difference if I call, it doesn't make any difference if I write, I can't make any changes. Impress upon people how much impact one voice can have.
Well, let me say it dramatically. Throughout American history, it's only a handful of people who've made a difference. It's never been 30%, 50, 70% of the people. You take every major movement, the women's right to vote, abolition of slavery, set aside the Civil War, but when it started in the 1800s, early 1800s, the farmer, labor, progressive movements, the Social Security, the Medicare drive, never took more than 1% of the people. Sometimes only a few hundred. Why did they have such power? 3 reasons. 1, they were determined. 2, they knew what they were talking about. And 3, they had the public opinion backing of the mass of the American people. Like, they wanted safe cars. They wanted clean drinking water. They wanted clean air. Maybe they wouldn't spend time buttonholing their senators and representatives. That's what the 1% or less of the people get done. So it's like Margaret Mead, you know, it's like you can hardly find a progress in human history for justice where there was anything more than a handful of people. By the way, starting with 1, then 2, then 4, right? And then becomes a critical mass. The key is every congressional district. If you want Congress to do it, you got to work in congressional districts, a handful of Congress watchdogs. In fact, we did a fable just recently trying to get people to laugh themselves seriously enough to organize Congress watchdog groups on your senators and representatives. And we called it How the Rats Reformed the Congress. You want to get an idea what it's like, viewers? Just go to ratsreformcongress.org. You'll get a tutorial that's quite serious about how you can start, no big deal, a letterhead organization, starting with a few dozen people, where you live, where you work, in a congressional district, and you'll reach a point, faster than you think, where you can actually summon your representative and your senator to your own town meetings. Talk about what you want to talk about and send them back with your instructions. And people say, oh, come on, you can't get these politicians. You know, they're they're not worried about people like us. I say, look, 300 names clearly written on a petition with their occupation and with their contact information will get a representative to your town meeting. 500 names will get a senator, a U.S. senator, to your town meeting. Now, who can stop you from doing that? Stop making excuses for yourself.
I want to give you a chance to add a couple of things. One, any final thoughts that you would leave people with about the state of the airline industry and specifically the 737 MAX 8?
That safety is going to be degrading. The economic gouging of you is going to get worse because they never stop until you make them stop. They used to charge $50 for reservation change. Nothing happened. They collected it. Then 100. Nothing happened. Then Delta went up to 150. Nothing happened. They're up to 200. They'll never stop squeezing you into those tighter spaces so you can get more seats in the plane. They're charging you for everything but breathing. So the only way you can stop them is to join with others, a group like flyersrights.org. And apart from that, contact your member of Congress when you meet them. Sometimes they're campaigning around, shaking hands. Make sure you shake their minds as well.
And final thoughts about Samya?
Well, Samya's going to live on because she was 24 years old, just the kind of person you want from the millennials. She had her iPhone and she had text messages. And we'd say, you know, might be overdoing it, Samya. But she had a commitment to global health. She'd already done field work in Africa. She had a master's from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She had intellectual rigor. She had compassion. She had a ability to cut through bureaucracy and see through phonies. I once said to her, you know, Samya, the biggest problem in the citizen movement is recruiting good people, and very few people know how to interview and cut through the phoniness and the screen. I'd like to have you be one of the recruiters. That's how good she was. So she had compassion, intellectual rigor, and leadership qualities, great sense of humor, and could she ever cook up a meal? And she's gone. So how do you make her live on? And the families have all gotten together, and they're going to make sure that you, the airline passenger, and you, the flight crews, and you, the air traffic controller, are going to get backing, you're going to get respect, you're going to get training, you're going to get dealt fairly with as passengers, and you're going to have a safer experience in air travel here and all around the world. That's all they can really do.
And what is next for you in terms of this fight with Boeing and the FAA and upcoming congressional hearings? What's next?
Well, Boeing has to be criminally prosecuted as a company, and the bosses have to be criminally prosecuted. It's a clear series of avoidable criminal negligence. I mean, the press has laid it out. The press has been doing a great job. It's all there. You have a grand jury underway, an FBI, Justice Department probe, criminal prosecution, conviction, and penalties. And that will deter future bosses from suppressing their own engineering judgment as to how not to cut too many corners on safety in order to make more profit. That's one. The second is to make sure that Boeing MAX never flies again. And the third is to make sure that the victims get adequate compensation in their tort lawsuits that are now in the courts, and they get accurate information out to the media and to the public. Because sometimes these civil suits will get far better information through depositions, through subpoena, than politically restrained criminal prosecutors might.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please watch tonight at 6 o'clock, everyone, on WJLA, which is ABC 7 in D.C. We're also going to post it on our website. We've got a story about Samya with her parents. I went up to their beautiful farm home in rural Massachusetts about a week ago and spent the day with them. So that piece is on. We've got a fabulous personality profile on Samya that goes into some of the things Ralph was just talking about. And then we're going to post the interview with her folks, Nadia and Mike, in full, because we just couldn't possibly fit all of that good information into one story on air. So 6 o'clock tonight, it's all going to be there on WJLA.
And by the way, additional answer to your question,
Yes.
we have to get legislation through Congress to turn the FAA into a tough, independent regulator instead of a delegator to the aircraft manufacturers.
Well said. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.